back to Mid-Maryland Votes. Our guest tonight is no stranger to the show. It's Hagerstown City Councilman Sean Flaherty. He returns and is bringing frontline insight into crime, addiction, and the challenges facing his city. Now he's taken that fight a step further, officially declaring his run as a Republican candidate for Maryland Delegate. We're talking policy, we're talking priorities, and what it really takes to turn communities around. Now let's get into it. Welcome to Mid-Maryland Votes. I am your host, Mark Flynn. With me is my co-host,
Ethan Lowen.
And we have a very distinguished guest on tonight. We have Sean Flaherty, returning guest of the show, one of our favorites, Councilman of the city of Hagerstown, Maryland. Sean, welcome to the program again.
I appreciate you guys having me on.
You're fun to have on, Sean.
Never a dull moment. You have recently made a additional political decision in your political career. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, about a few weeks ago, I officially announced that I'm running for state delegate here in Hagerstown. It's 2B. Our state delegate district just encompasses the city of Hagerstown. So I've been very concerned about the direction our state's going into with the high taxes, high fees, high utilities. You know, we have people complaining to me all the time about that. You know, Maryland's losing more residents than people that are moving here. That's a big issue. You know, I think we need to make it more economically business friendly. And, you know, we're going to be in another budget deficit this year. And unfortunately, from what I know, the state legislature is just going to transfer more taxes and fees and things like that just so they don't have to raise taxes this year. And I have a few bulletin points to talk about that. But, you know, I think we have several programs like the Maryland Blueprint that's kind of bankrupting us and things that should be relooked at. But I really support, you know, my campaign platform is the budget, you know, public safety, making sure, you know, our firemen and our police are properly funded. And I think as a state, we need to do a better job of addressing the police shortages nationwide. We've done the best we can in the city limits in Hagerstown. You know, I think taxes are a huge problem. You know, Governor Moore in the state legislature, the last session passed, you know, the IT tax, and that had several businesses leave the state. You know, I would be in favor of repealing that. And we have the economy. We have to be more competitive towards other states. We can't be as reliant on the federal government and our workforce. We have to diversify our economy. So I think that's a big thing. And, you know, utilities, it's a huge thing. And as you know, people are getting $600-700 utility bills, if not more. And people come crying to us, you know, even in the city and saying, I can't afford this. How am I going to, you know, pay this? You know, and the big thing I have lastly for my campaign is redistricting. I believe Marylanders, you know, want a free and fair and transparent process for maps. And I don't think that, you know, the governor's power grab recently with doing that, you know, right before the 2030 census makes a lot of sense. But I am very thankful for, you know, Senate President Bill Ferguson, who put the brakes on that, said, no, you know, this is going to probably go to court and the Hogan appointees are going to throw it out. And you might actually have more maps more favorable to Republicans. So I think if we're transparent with the voters to begin with, and, you know, we really look out for their interest, I don't think we'll have an issue there.
Can you explain to us what a delegate's responsibilities are, what the job is, and who presently does it?
Yeah, so, you know, basically a state delegate is your representative, you know, locally to the state legislature in Annapolis, 2B. You know, you meet 4 months out of the year by the state constitution. You know, you pass bills, you pass, you know, budgets, you know, you're on committees, you do oversight. Because that's what, you know, basically kind of like what congressmen and senators do for the federal part, you do this statewide. And as you know, we have a lot of pressing issues. We have a lot of state audits that we're failing that need to be looked at a little bit more closer. And, you know, that's what your main job is to do. But you meet 4 months out of the year. But when I say 4 months out of the year, that's when you officially meet. But you're always responding to emails and constituents, and you're doing your work way past the 4 months. Just like we meet for city council once a week, but I'm still having to meet with people and, you know, answering their concerns and, you know, questions throughout the week. But that's what basically a Maryland, you know, state delegate does. And it's broken. Like I said, there's some districts that have multiple delegates, I believe. 2B here in Hagerstown only has one. The current incumbent is Matthew Schindler, who was previously on city council as well.
Matt Schindler, we actually had him here a few weeks ago and we interviewed him. How many are in the field?
Well, luckily, I have no Republican primary challenger. I was the only one that did file. And if I didn't file, Matthew wouldn't have a challenger. Matthew does have a challenger in the primary, Shawana Baker. So he does have a primary come up in June. I do not.
Shawana Baker was recently in the news for a conviction for an assault charge. Wasn't that?
Yes, I heard that, and I heard she got released from court and everything else. So I don't know much about her. I just know that I watched the video on Radio Free Hub about her punching a Trump supporter, but I didn't get into details about that or anything like that. But yeah, I do know she's running for office against Matthew in the Democratic primary.
And of course, your opponent being Matthew Schindler. So being the delegate for 2B, like you said, you're on the county council, you're on the city council for Hagerstown, and the delegate for 2B represents the same geography. So you're simply moving from local representation to state representation for the same community whose issues that you've been working on now since you've been elected. What would you say are some of the biggest differences between you and your opponent, Matt Schindler?
Well, I mean, I like Matthew personally. I have nothing against him. I think he's a great stand-up guy. He's my neighbor. He lives around the corner. So personally, I think he's a great dad to his son. But I think his problem is he's voted too far left-wing for this district. He voted for a reparations commission. He's voted for the new redistricting maps. He's voted for the governor's, utilities and tax hikes, which I really think are hurting Maryland families. So I think he's had a horrendous voting record for 2B. And I think that we need somebody more in lockstep with the values and, the views of government within 2B in this area than somebody that's going to be in lockstep with the governor and, the Democrats in Annapolis. And as Maryland's a very blue state. So Democrats control everything. They have a supermajority in Annapolis. It's very hard to get anything done. But I do believe going more into the middle and moderating, and I don't think anybody wants higher taxes and fees. I don't care your income bracket. If you make over $500,000 a year, making $50,000 a year, that's going to affect you in some shape or form. And I really think we need to do a better job of addressing that.
Well, I am a moderate in the middle, Sean, and I agree with you. I don't want to hear the extremism on either side. I want to hear somebody who has a plan to hit the issues that affect me the most. And like you said, cost of living, power, the cost of energy, crime in Hagerstown, all of these are key points for me. And you discussed a little bit. Can you go into a little more detail on how you would attack some of those issues?
Yeah, I think with budget, there's a lot of things we can cut. Like I mentioned previously, the Maryland Blueprint's kind of bankrupting us. It's a reason why we've continuously, have had tons of budget deficits, and it's getting passed time to time. So that's a big thing of, just looking at our budget and what can we do and what can we not do that, live within our means. Because I do think if we're living in a very economic uncertainty that, government has to live, if you as a resident and as a taxpayer have to live within your means, government should too, and we can't afford a lot of new frivolous spending and programs that, like a reparations commission. And, I think that, okay, you want to address the wrongs of what happened before, but at what expense with the taxpayer money are we going to afford to do that? So I think really just looking at common sense, my big thing for my campaign, and if you look on my campaign website, flahertyfordelegate.com, is lower taxes, common sense. And that's what I support. And I think a lot of moderate Democrats and a lot of reasonable people support that too. They don't afford, like you said, America's becoming increasingly more polarized on the left and right. You have the right going downhill with some of the MAGA craziness, and then you have some of the left going with the AOC craziness, and nothing's getting done for people in the middle that really need the help. And a lot of the folks that elect us expect us to come to the table, put our differences aside, and work for the people. And that's what I will continue to do when I'm elected. So, but I mean, there's a lot of ways about going that. Like I said, the budget, I think, there's a lot of cutting we can spend. And my big problem is we are one of the largest recipients of federal aid as a state, and we need to not be so reliant on that. We need to attract other jobs, other investments here, and I don't think, the idea of us being so reliant on federal government is a good idea, because then, they want to blame Trump for the budget deficits and things here, but that's really the state legislators' fault. They're the ones that have to put the budget forth. It's not Donald Trump, and they have to decide what they're going to do to vote on that. And, I think there's a lot that could be seen there. And I have a few statistics I'll just throw out, but we're in a $1.5 billion budget deficit, for this fiscal year coming up. They're already projected for the fiscal year 28. We're going to be in a greater budget deficit at $2.3 billion, and as you can see right now, they're basically restructuring and reshuffling the money from Maryland's investment funds to cover the deficit. And that's not really addressing the real hardcore issues of government spending. And that's not what they're doing. Like I said, We've already given free health care to illegal aliens. They're trying to do that and things such of that nature. And, and that's not really the scope of government. I think we need to address more quality of life issues than social justice issues.
And to your point about the budget deficits, I mean, last year, Governor Moore put out a projection for the budget that showed that within 4 years, 2030, we are going to have a 16% deficit, which when he put that out, I was shocked because it is a fairy tale number. It's actually just a self-destructive number that if any CEO of any corporation or nonprofit had ever went to their board and said, we're planning on a 16% deficit, everyone would be canned right there on the spot. I mean, it's that ridiculous. I call it the Three Stooges budget. Obviously, you've mentioned that a couple times so far already. What specifically would you do to help contain what is truly a catastrophic budget situation?
Yeah, so first of all, don't increase taxes on anyone or anything. I would say that I would like to repeal the B2B tax. They put that 3% tax on all IT digital sales. That's not helping us. There's a lot of taxes I would love to repeal on that. And also right now, I would also very much support repealing the Climate Solutions Act of 2022, which basically makes the state reduce, greenhouse gas emissions by 2031. And by doing that, they also add a tax on utilities. And so I would support completely repealing that as well. And like I said, the Maryland Blueprint is bankrupting us. I would be open to looking at additional sources of revenue, how to fund that, or get rid of it together. Because right now, what's happening in Annapolis, they're just throwing the can down the road and making local municipalities and governments shoulder the cost of these, crazy programs instead of, people in Annapolis paying for it. And right now, they don't really want to pass a tax increase in 2026 because it's an election year. But what's going to happen the moment, after November? They're going to come back to looking at that. So, but I really do believe the Climate Solutions Act, was pretty bad. And, I also would want to get rid of the Empower Maryland program, which adds the fees to electric bills and funds greenhouse gas emissions. We should repeal that. I mean, you're already adding taxes and fees, and then you wonder why utility companies are doing things on that. And I would also say I do support, clean coal. And I think that, wind and solar, there's nothing wrong with that. But we don't have enough of that to support the rest of our electrical grid and things like that. So honest with you, there's a lot to look there that can be cut and things that we don't have to commit to, and it's going to be a long process, and I'm willing to work with Democrats to get that done.
So you talked about some key issues, Sean. One is that as a super blue majority state, and you running as a Republican, you're going to have to win the middle. And I can tell you that middle is me. I'm a moderate. I'm in the middle. I'm not extreme on both sides. And I am sick and tired of hearing the Democrats kick the can down the road, blame Trump for everything, basically, install fees and taxes that are crippling all of us, and then blaming other people for it, never taking personal responsibility. What's your feelings on those issues?
Yeah, I mean, you go to the DMV, it's twice as much to register your car and renew your tags and fees. That could have been avoided. And right now, I'm just looking here. I had some. We also have the highest utilities in the state. In the country, actually. Marylanders pay an average of $546 per month and $6,500 annually. And on top of that, the Democrats just want to go after the power companies, but they're not doing anything to realistically lower that as well. But the taxes and fees are a huge problem. And I mean, I hate to say it, but I do believe a fee is a tax. When I go to the DMV, it costs 100%. Me twice as much, for my Subaru to get registered. And it's funny, I did do that last year, right before that all happened. And I was like, I'm going to do this before that law comes into effect in July. So, again, you're asking more Marylanders to make more sacrifices out of their pockets. And, as you know, inflation's still incredibly high. Everything's very expensive for everybody. But if we have to live within our means, so should government. You should be tightening your belt here. You shouldn't be spending on programs we can't afford. I don't think government can be everything to everybody, And I do want our people that live in the state to get the benefits first, and I want us to do that. But again, I think really there's a lot there to look at and poke at. And I think we need leadership that's going to recognize where we're at and what we got to do to get out of there. And I think the status quo of just voting along with whatever budget, whatever the party says, is not really working for anybody. And we're leaving. I mean, I have folks telling me, they don't feel safe, or they're going to move to West Virginia or Pennsylvania. You go over the West Virginia borderline, they're building left and right. They don't have nearly the regulations. Tonight, we had a city council meeting about, our recent rent control meeting discussion. The majority of overwhelming residents were against rent control. But again, we're not creating policies that are conducive to economic growth. They're not building like they should here. We have a housing shortage. We have a police shortage, and it's bad in the state, but the cities are even worse. So, I think we really just got to get back to the basics of governing, not get into the social justice issues and quality of life issues is what I care more about. No one's not going to care about the ICE facility if they can't make their mortgage payment or their rent, or they can't find a decent paying job. And I want Washington County, especially Hagerstown, to get that. There's even been talk about a potential data center coming here down the road. We'll see if that happens or not, but I'd be open to that because we technically need higher incomes. And as you know, Hagerstown has a very transient population of folks getting released from the prisons. They also have a lot of services here. And we've had a problem when I did the homeless shelter tour that they said, well, we love Hagerstown because you guys have all the services. And we've had Pennsylvania and New Mexico drop off people here. And that's not the type of folks we want to attract. I mean, I'm all for getting folks help, but we want higher incomes, IT workers, things like that. And, Frederick's got more of that. Frederick County's got more of that money. And I think there's a lot of things we can do better here. But I've always said, we need to do a better job of diversifying our economy in Maryland, not just Hagerstown, but, not be so dependent on the federal government. And it's great that we do border the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., but, we got to stand on our own 2 feet, regardless of Republican or Democrats in power.
Yeah. Now, something you mentioned in Hagerstown just recently, that's a big issue, is rent control. And not just Hagerstown, Montgomery County, other places throughout the state. Can you explain to us how something like rent control, as an example, is something government does that seems like it benefits people, but in the long run actually hurts our ability to even take care of the needy over the long run?
Oh, exactly. You're exactly right. I think that government does want to tackle the issue, but more government isn't the answer. I've always believed in letting the free market decide, what the prices are for rent. And a big problem, like I said, is supply and demand. It's a lot like California, which I don't want Maryland to continue being like that, where they get a fixer-upper for $800,000 and sell it for $2 million. Because right now that's what's happening in California. They refuse to build any new housing because of the environmental regulations and everything else. And they have a lot of NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks, that take over. They don't want any type of new development. And that also hinders the people that are waiting for homes here. And then what does become available in the market's overly expensive. And, it's the top bidder. So my thing is we've got to build. In tonight's city council meeting, we talked a lot about that extensively, how West Virginia is doing a really good job of that, and how Maryland has really, made it harder to do business here. And I lived in this area many years ago when I was a kid. I grew up in Cedar Falls, which is right outside of Hagerstown. I went to Mogginsville Elementary. And when I moved back to Hagerstown in 2021, I was very astonished there was not the type of growth here like South Carolina. South Carolina's building left and right. There's new neighborhoods everywhere. They're saying, come on down here, we're open for business. I don't really get a sense that much of that's happening here in Maryland. And now they are saying Washington County is growing better than other counties in the state, but it's still stagnant, in my opinion, compared to the overall other states. And now South Carolina is now ranked as the most fastest growing state in the country, and people are fleeing there, and the taxes. And those are people, the comptroller just released a report saying more people have left Maryland than moving in. We lost 500,000 people recently, and those are taxpayers fleeing with their feet. And, we need to make it more conducive for them to stay here, not raise the taxes, not raise utilities, make housing affordable, be more business friendly. And let me see, right, well, I can go look at this a little bit more. But Maryland ranks number 4th as the most expensive state to do business in. It says Maryland ranks number 42 for economic outlook with a sluggish economy and job creation because they're too, relying on the federal government. And right now we have the ballooning business cost. We have federal layoffs, and I was a casualty of that. I got laid off my job, and but again, I'm not blaming Donald Trump or Washington D.C. for that. I mean, again, I still have to get a job and do my best, but again, I think that we need a better job of attracting other types of jobs here. And we are one of the highest, like I said, one of the highest state taxes right now. Maryland's top tax rate is 6.5% with an additional 3.3 local income. And then the property tax rate can go as high as 2.45%. I mean, there's a reason why people are fleeing here, and that has to be reformed and changed. I mean, right now, Florida, South Carolina, my home state, is trying to get rid of their own state income tax. The Republicans running for governor there are trying to advocate for that. Although I don't think that's ever going to happen here, but there's a lot of other things we can lower and get rid of.
You mentioned earlier the crime aspect and how people want to live in an area that's safe. By the way, hi, Zelda.
She's gnawing at me and wants to growl and play.
I saw that. It's okay. Yeah. We love dogs on this show. You know that. Anyway, so crime. Let's talk about crime a little bit, okay? People want livable areas, and your beat, if you win this delegate job, is going to be Hagerstown, which is considered not the greatest grades for safety, for drug addiction, for chemical addiction, for homelessness. What is your plan for addressing the crime issue? And you mentioned the fact that Hagerstown City Police is understaffed and undermanned.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are not where we need to be. I think we are a little better than when I first got sworn in. I think, when you have the anti-police sentiments, especially when you see a lot of them not wanting to work with law enforcement, and as you know, the recent ICE facility made a lot of national headlines here. That doesn't help morale with recruitment and retention. I think that we definitely need to propose better benefits and things for them. I'd even propose letting firefighters and, teachers and even, police to get, what can we do to help them buy the city limits or give them some type of tax break, things like that. I think I've advocated for that in city council. I'll do the same if I'm a state delegate. And we did get the anti-camping ordinance passed. I've been a very vocal, proponent of that. I think that does deter homelessness. And yeah, it's going to be a struggle no matter what. As you know, Hagerstown does struggle. We are a city and, we do deal with the drugs a lot. And I think a lot of the policies in Annapolis have hurt folks here where they just give out free needles, free Narcan, free drug paraphernalia. And it's just a continuously endless cycle. And until we change some of the folks in Annapolis that support those policies, I don't see how that's going to change long term. And, I get residents that complain to me all the time about needles and things in their neighborhood. And I do feel for them and I walk with them, but I go by their home at election time and they still vote for the same people that are still supporting these policies. So you kind of got to get what you vote for. And until people make that correlation of what they're voting for and what policies are affecting them, I don't know how that's going to change. But I would say that, right now, yeah, we have some challenging times for HPD, but I definitely think that as a state, like you said, Baltimore, they have had a huge issue with, recruiting police there. And if people don't feel safe and they see drugs and they see people, walking around like the Walking Dead, they're not going to want to buy a property there. They're not going to invest in there. And they don't care how many nice amenities your city has. They're just not going to spend their time there. And I hate that folks will give up and pass Hagerstown for that. And I think we can do better than that. And, what we talked about in tonight's city council meeting was how Baltimore has that program where they can get, buy the vacant properties for $1 and somebody can go in and reflip it, and we need more of that here. We have a problem where a lot of LLCs are buying properties here. There's no accountability. They take very minimum care of that. And I think if we can turn more properties and give them over to actual homeowners, I think property rates will go up. People will value their home more. And I think property owners take care of their property better than a lot of renters do. And so I think there's a whole lot of slew of issues we can do to address that. But, I do think that, the drugs, the crime has been a consistent issue. And, and I hate to say this, it's been very bad in blue states where you see that's why people are leaving too. They don't feel safe. And Baltimore's lost a lot of population. I know that recently Mayor Brandon Scott has touted they've regained some of that back, but it wasn't enough to completely make up for the loss of folks that are leaving. And it's usually the high income people or people that are middle class that make okay a living. You're like, why am I paying the taxes and fees here when I don't feel safe to leave my house during the day? I see people doing prostitution and drugs on my corner. I don't have an incentive to stay here anymore. And they're going to go to Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. And those states are gaining in population. And that's also going to have a political bad outcome for Democrats, because what's going to happen is in the presidential elections, Republicans are going to continuously get more of the electoral college votes in those states. And Democrats are going to continue to lose, their own representation. So I think that's really an alarm bell with the comptroller's report about people leaving, that we need a better job of, public safety, taxes, utilities, all those things here, and make it quality of life issues. In the end of the day, whether you voted for Trump or Harris, you're still going to get your tax bill and utilities, and you're still going to have to pay for that. And I think a lot of common sense Democrats and people here would agree with me. We can do better. I think we can. And, I don't know between us how much I'll get done, because Annapolis is one party rule. They have a supermajority and everything. But I think we need, and I did put in my press release, we need checks and balances with one party rule. We need somebody looking at things and saying, hey, this isn't right. This isn't what you're doing. Like the maps right now, redistricting is a huge, big issue here. And, I already feel like living in the 6th district, we're already disenfranchised, because our previous representative and our current one don't even live in our own district, and so they just come up here to do photo ops and do all that, but they kind of stay in Frederick and Montgomery. And I do believe that Marylanders want more from their government, and they don't want all one party rule everywhere in the state.
I think that, this area, Western Maryland, has a lot of common sense Democrats, and they don't want, this radical leftism going on. They just want to live their lives in a way that, that is mutually beneficial for everybody.
I said, even my grandma's a Democrat, and she told me how she disappointed in Governor Moore and how far left they've gone. And Governor Moore's just worried about running for president in 28. He's barely visited Hagerstown since he's been governor. So again, honestly, it's going to be a tough race for Republicans this year in a midterm, as you know. Democrats are energized. They don't like Trump. But I think if we have a common sense message of how to reach voters, which I did that for city council 2 years ago, I know I can do it again here, because I don't think people want their taxpayer monies going to our reparations commissions. They don't want higher utilities and fees. They don't want property, higher property taxes. Everybody's crying to me about the recent state property tax assessments going up and how it's just crazy and they can't afford it. So, again, we can't push the folks that do want to live here, that want to contribute, that want to make our state better, and push them out. We need to make them stay here. And we need people in Annapolis that recognize that are going to fight for them and not fight for the status quo that we currently have now.
And I actually think that you may be discounting a little bit the ability that you have to make a difference. In the city, you won the election based on a very clear, very specific points, and people voted for that, and obviously proved that Democrats and Republicans agreed that that is what they want, is what you were running on. I think that you are beating a drum that people are listening to, and they want others to listen to it. So I want to congratulate you on what I think is really a very compelling message that has worked once and may very well work again. We know that it represents a lot of people.
And I think without an R or a D attached to it, Sean, common sense is what people are looking for. There's small issues on the side and the left, and there's extremists on both sides. But people really just want to be led by a politician who's got integrity, has got a plan, and seems to have a grasp on the issues that affect them the most.
Well, and that's what it's all about, really. It's quality of life. I said it's not social justice issues. I think that, nobody wants higher taxes. Nobody wants higher utilities. And, but you can't continue voting for people that support that. And I've been against that on city council. I was the only council member to vote against all their property tax increases. I voted against all the red lights getting reinstalled here, because I think it robs people of their due process, and it's a moneymaker. I get why local jurisdictions love them because it gives them money, but I don't support that. I support you that's paying my taxes so you can have a better life, and you have less taxes to pay on, and you can spend it on other things. You got kids, take them out to eat or do something with that. And I do think we do have that in common, that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And, I think common sense has been going out the way for a while now, but I do support that. And, I don't support social experimentation in schools and all this other crazy stuff. I just want us to get back to the basics, and I think smaller government, lower taxes is the key for really economic success, and, letting the government, you can live with your own individual liberties intact, and I support the Second Amendment and things. And even that's crazy to even buy a pistol in Maryland with the loopholes you got to go through for that. Because I live in South Carolina. basically handed out like candy almost with what you got to do.
With a bank loan.
Yeah. I kind of, but so there's a lot of things to look at that tackle and to reduce, and right now, as you know, the state is failing a lot of audits within their departments. That's unacceptable. And I haven't seen a whole lot from the governor's office about how to remedy that or what to fix on that. Well, he has actually not the highest approval ratings for being in a blue state. Hogan, who's a Republican, had higher approval ratings than Moore has since he's been elected. So
Moore's approval ratings dropped 15%. Now, it's still the majority. It's more than 50% that approve of him. But the significant fact is that it's dropped 15% in just the last 2 years alone. People are not impressed with his leadership skills.
Well, he doesn't come to Hagerstown. He just wants to go on The View and talk about how bad the mean orange man is. But we need leadership in Annapolis, and he's not really providing that when it comes to the budget. Even his own party's overriding his vetoes left and right. I mean, they even overrode his, reparations commission, which I believe Delegate Schindler voted for that override. So, I mean, it's pretty bad that even his own party doesn't take him seriously and they just over veto him. So, but I do tell people, Marylanders, we do have a choice. We don't have to vote for the same people with the same tax increases and, to do your research on the candidates. And I think, it's really beholden up to the voters to hold their own folks to be accountable. And apathy is what kills democracy. Apathy is what kills the democratic process when they stop caring and they stop showing up to vote. And then they're just not going to do it anymore. There's probably a lot of people in Maryland that think, well, this is a blue state. My vote's not going to really count here. So I'm just going to sit at the couch on election day. When I first moved back to Hagerstown after many years in South Carolina, I almost thought the same thing. I said, well, this is a very blue state. How far could I go in here with my vote? I never expected I would move back to Hagerstown, much less run for anything, much less win. So I didn't, I kind of thought, but locally here, the local elections matter. I do tell folks you can't, as a Republican in the state, you can't have much of an effect on federal elections, but the local stuff you do. And I think people are tuning more into that a lot.
Well, Sean, we want to thank you for being on tonight on Mid-Maryland Votes. You've done a great job explaining a lot of the issues. If folks want to help you out in your campaign, where would they go to find out more information?
Yeah, just come to my website. It's flahertyfordelegate.com. There's even a link on there to my Facebook page. I'm still trying to build that more. I do have a councilman page too, which is separate. I'm trying to keep my councilman business, stuff, see it separate from the delegate stuff. But just go on there. I don't have a primary challenger, but I don't take any race for granted. I campaign like I'm 50 points behind. And, I think this will be an uphill year for my party and for me. But I do think if I bring the issues of common sense and, lower taxes and a better quality of life to the residents of Hagerstown, they're going to want to vote for somebody who supports that.
And I believe your opponent's voting history is going to become an important part of this election.
Well, like I said, I love Matthew personally, but it's egregious what he's done, and it's pretty bad. We voted for reparation. I mean, he's voted far left, just like with Delegate Moon in Annapolis and Joe Vogel, which is pretty horrendous because they're Montgomery County delegates, which vote far left. And to be Hagerstown is not far left. We deserve better, and we really deserve someone who's going to look out for their pocketbook and their wallets. And I don't see a lot of people in Annapolis doing that for the taxpayers.
Excellent point. Thanks again, Sean, for being with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me and Zelda on.
So this has been Mark Flynn with Mid-Maryland Votes. With me, as always, is my co-host,
Ethan Lowen.
And we just want to thank Sean Flaherty, who's councilman for the city of Hagerstown and now a candidate for delegate for Maryland as well. Thanks for being on the show. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and share it with your friends. If you didn't like it, well, then share it with your enemies. We're equal opportunity entertainment. Thank you for being on
Hagerstown City Councilman Sean Flaherty, now a Republican candidate for Maryland Delegate. As always, he brings a direct, on-the-ground perspective shaped by real experience in the community that he serves. We appreciate him coming back and continuing the conversation. Thanks for tuning in to Mid-Maryland Votes. Like, follow, and share for more content like this, and we'll see you next time on Mid-Maryland Votes.